Good evening. Yeah, my watch shows 6:30, and I know that I have no chance to cover everything even if I want, so I don't want to waste time. Who was here last week? Most of you were. It's okay if you weren't. I just want to connect. So last week we talked about more or less Chanukah. Remember who was the first person the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans killed? A Jew. Okay, so even though we tell the story and remember the story of Chanukah as a fight between the Jews and the Greeks, or sometimes we call the Greek Syrians, nothing is clear because we use the word Hasmoneans or Maccabees, which is more or less the same, and Greeks, and the Syrians, which in this context is about the same. But the first person they killed was a fellow Jew. And why did they kill him? Who did this Jew represent? The Hellenized Jews. Okay, Hellenism, the whole concept, was people who adapted Greek culture, language, politics, people who like to go to the gymnasium, etc. It did not mean, for the most part, that people converted into something else. Okay? The Hellenized Jews are more 99% of American Jews. We can be Jews, we can observe whatever we observe, we can worship our ways, but for the most part, you, not me, have American names, we speak English, we like American culture and baseball. Okay? But we don't see it as a contradiction. We take it for granted. But at that point, it was not taken for granted. Okay, so there were people who said, okay, now the Greeks are in control. We like what they have to offer. Let's take most of what they have to offer. We don't have to take the religious component. We don't have to have a statue of Zeus or slaughter animals to their gods. We don't need that. But everything culturally, why not? And Greek culture was the culture of the time. And it was much more sophisticated than what they had before. However, there was a group of more extreme Jews who said everything Greek is wrong. Okay? So the Maccabees were part of these groups that resisted anything Greek. It had to be purely Jewish the way they saw it. Okay? So the first person who was killed in their war was not a Greek soldier, it was a Jew who agreed to worship in a Greek way because he just did not want to be killed by the Jews. So this is more or less something we talked about last week. And then the Hasmoneans, I'll keep calling them Hasmoneans because this is slightly more accurate terms, but this is the new dynasty, very quickly became Hellenized as well. So they fought against it, but a generation later, well, the Greeks had too much good stuff to offer to keep resisting it. Again, it is not to say, and I read it somewhere, and it's so inaccurate, that they did not observe the Jewish ways. They did. But the language became more Greek than Hebrew or Aramaic. Okay, their names, as we'll see today, will be Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, but these were the cool names of the time. They really loved the gymnasium because it gave you education and physical activities that back then as today, nobody can really say it's a bad thing. They loved the new style of markets, of the economy. and were Jewish. They prayed in a Jewish way. They worshiped a Jewish God in a Jewish way. They studied Jewish texts, okay? So it's really important to remember it. It's not that Jews who converted to the Greek religion, etc., versus the Jews. No, all of them were influenced by Greeks, but some less and some more. What I want to do today, I pivoted a little bit from the style of last week. I want to focus mostly on documents, on sources. Instead of me telling you stuff, I want us to look at several interesting events that took place in the 160 years between the Hasmoneans. No, it's 230 years between the Hasmoneans and the destruction of the first temple. So let's look at page 1. I made it easy. Remember to put page numbers, which is, no, it's a good thing for me. I try to do it now when I have a blank page before I even write the first word, because then I forget. So we're going to look at this. So they established a new dynasty, and I mentioned it briefly, and I want to say it again. Until the Hasmoneans, there was a clear division between two positions, king and high priest. Since biblical times, that was the case. A legitimate king has to come from the family of David. A legitimate high priest has to come from the family of Aaron and a specific family by the name of the Zadokites. Okay? But these were the dynasties, and maybe today we don't like the concept of hereditary positions, but back then, of course, if you want to be a king, the only way to be a king is for your father to be a king. Okay, more or less. And it's even written in our Bible that that's the way. A legitimate king must be a descendant of David. The Hasmoneans were neither from the descendants of David, nor from the family of the Zadokite, the family that produced the high priests. So they were priests, but sort of marginalized priests. But not only that they crowned themselves or anointed themselves as high priests, they also became at the same time kings. So they unified these two positions, king and the high priest. Today we would call it separation of state and church, right? But it was more or less separated in ancient Israel, and they reversed it. And that was not a popular act. Why did they do it? Of course, power. If you can consolidate the religious power, which was very significant, as well as the secular or political power, you have much more of it. And since they came from almost nothing, now having these two positions, put them very high on the totem pole of the leadership and position. So this is the background for what we are doing. So let's read first the text about Jordan Hyrcanus. Just by the name, you can see, you don't need to know much about who he was, but what does the name say? Greek. Right? These names you don't see in the Bible. Okay? Completely Greek. And it's about 110 or so BC, before the Common Era, about 60 years after Judah Maccabee and the revolt against the Greeks. Is there anyone who would like to read? Okay, I will read, I guess. Yeah, maybe, because as long as you use the mic.
John Hyrcanus, a Hasmonean ruler and high priest, was for the most of his life close to the Pharisees. Josephus says he was admired as both a capable leader and a pious man, and that he followed Pharisaic teaching.
Okay, let's pause for a second and let me talk about the main two factions that came out of the Hasmoneans dynasty. One of them were called the Pharisees. The Pharisees were not priests. They were students of the law. They will later on become the rabbis and those who will redefine Judaism. Okay? It's important they were not priests. Maybe few Pharisees were just by tribe, but they were anti-priests. They accepted some of the priests, but for them, the Torah, the Jewish teaching, the halacha, the Jewish law, is open to everyone. You don't need to come from a specific family. If you are willing to dedicate yourself to studying, you can be the most important Jewish scholar leader. Okay? So these were the Pharisees. That was a new concept, that everything is open. You don't have to come from a specific family or a specific tribe. Because the previous model, even in the Torah, is that everything that is related to Jewish tradition, Jewish observance, is limited to the family of the Cohens, right? Cohens, whatever you want to call these people, or the priests. Okay, so in order to practice on behalf of the community Judaism, you had to be born to these families, right? To part of the tribe of Levi, part of the family of Aaron, who was Moses' brother, and they had inclusivity. They were the only one who were allowed to worship on behalf of the people, to rule different laws, etc. The priest had not only political power and religious power, but they also had money. Because today, when we pay taxes, we pay the taxes to the government. But who was de facto the government of the Jews? The ancient temple. Who worked at the temple? The priests. Okay, so even though, let's say that they never embezzled a penny, these positions were quite coveted, because the vast majority of the people were poor farmers. But if you have a higher position, it was a religious position, which became also, as I mentioned, political position, and you get your share, your taxation, right? You are in a good shape. The temple owned a lot of land. Nothing changed. I think that at least 20 years ago, the biggest owner of land in New York City was the Catholic Church, okay? Because religions and land went well together. So the ancient temple owned land, okay? So it was good to be a priest, and the higher you were, the better you did. So the Pharisees were against it. They said, no. You cannot have a monopoly over Judaism, over learning, over ruling laws. No, it's open for everyone. You don't have to be rich. You just have to have a little bit of brains and the desire to study. So that's the Pharisees. Unfortunately, unfortunately, these two words are quite close to each other. So Pharisees are the prototype of the rabbis. The other group, yes? No. No, I will mention it since you asked, but in a different way. I'll get to that. The Sadducees, I'm sorry, I didn't come up with it. Pharisees, PH, are we'll call them the rabbis. The Sadducees, let's call them the priests. Better? Okay? It's not 1,000,000% accurate, but it's better for us to. So the priests, the Sadducees, hated the Pharisees because they challenged them. They wanted to maintain their power. Because every group in the world throughout history wants to maintain their power. Nobody wants to give power away. So the priest always had power, always had the influence, the wealth. Why would they give it away or even share it with anyone else? Okay, so we have these two strong groups that came after the Hasmonean Revolt. One are the Pharisees and the Sadducees, or the rabbis versus the priest. They had one huge difference. The priests, the Sadducees, said that the Jewish law is determined only by the written Torah. Whatever the Torah says, that's the law. You don't interpret it, you don't do anything. That's the law. Okay? Of course, they said it because this law of the Torah made them the high priest and gave them all their power, money, influence, etc. The Pharisees, the proto-rabbi, said, no, Torah is super important because God gave us the Torah. But when God gave Moses the written Torah, God gave Moses also an oral Torah. So it's not only the written text, it's all the teachings that were done since Moses. All the interpretations are part of the Torah and are as valid as the Torah. Let me just give you an obvious example. How many kind of works you're not allowed to do on Shabbat according to the Torah? No, according to the Torah mentions only one thing you're not allowed to do on Shabbat: to light fire. Lighting fire, that's the only thing the Torah says. So there is a reference, maybe because there was a person who gathered some wood on Shabbat and paid a huge price for that, but there is still a debate among the scholars. The problem was that he gathered wood for fire, or maybe gathering, but really that's the only thing that the Torah says. So for the Sadducees, that was the deal. The Pharisees said, absolutely not. When the Torah talked about not working, there are 39 main works, and then from every one of them we derive million others, and the list contains hundreds, if not thousands, prohibitions of things you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. Now, we understand the written Torah. We say God gave it to us, so that was the priest. But who gave the rabbis the authority to say, no, the Torah is just a tiny bit, just the source, but from there you can derive almost anything you want? They said God gave it to Moses. That's what they call the oral Torah. So when the Torah says, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk, that's the only prohibition, right? Do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. The Sadducees said, yeah, we're not boiling a kid in its mother's milk because that's cruel, right? The Sadducees later on would say you have to wait 6 hours between eating chicken and cheese. How do you derive it? Well, definitely the Torah never talked about chicken and cheese, and chicken is not really beef. But that's what they, okay? But when the Sadducees said, they didn't say it's our opinion. They said, no, this is the oral Torah, and it is valid as the written Torah. So when we tell you that you cannot have cheese and milk, chicken and milk, sorry, it's as valid as what the Torah says, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Is it clear, the whole idea? And what they said is that, yes, God gave Moses 2 Torahs, the written Torah that we have in the Ark, and the oral Torah, all the interpretations, and the tools of how to interpret the Torah, how to derive new laws from the written Torah, and they are valid. So when you start reading Mishnah, it's part of the Mishnah. It was written around 250. This is the last part of the Mishnah. It starts by Moses received Torah from Sinai, meaning oral Torah and written Torah, and passed it on to the next leader. Who was the leader after Moses? Joshua. Okay? And then Joshua took that Torah, the written and the oral, and passed it on to the prophets, who passed it on to the next generation, to the men of the great assembly, etc. And every generation of the teachers, of the scholars, if you will, pass all this knowledge to the next generation, and they kept passing it on. And now we, the Pharisees, are part of this long line of tradition, chain of tradition that goes back to God and Moses. So what we tell you guys is not our opinion. It all came from God, who gave it to Moses, who gave it to Joshua, who gave it to the prophet, who gave it to the blah, 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 and then gave it to us. So there is a huge debate that existed until the year of 70, when the temple was destroyed and nobody needed a priest anymore. And the only one who were left, basically, were the rabbis. And the whole concept, the whole Judaism that we've known for more than 2,000 years is based on the oral Torah, not so much the written Torah. If you want to learn how to be a Jew, the Torah itself has little to do with it. But you needed to prove it. It's more sophisticated than that. You have to say that, for example, you don't eat chicken and cheese together, because you say, even though the Torah was talking about a kid, right? But we have a rule that is called Marit Ain. It's something that appears to be the case, even though it's not the case. So if I see you eating chicken in a bun with cheese, I may think that Bruce is not eating chicken, but he's eating actually beef. I know that Bruce will never eat beef, but you know, chicken and beef can look so much a little bit alike. So because to prevent people from suspecting that Bruce had in his burger bun chicken and not beef, so let's not mix now chicken and milk. Some people don't actually, but you can. According to the plain Jewish law, you can. Yes. Some very few people just say you cannot, because I still remember one time I had a tuna steak, which they used the very same grill that they use for regular steaks, and I couldn't tell the difference. Yeah, I remember the place. It was in Montauk, New York, and I looked and said, yeah, no, Yeah, it can definitely, tuna steak can look like steak, but but I emphasize it just for that to see that the rabbi said, our scholarship, we can use the rules of interpretations to derive any new laws, we can adjust to new situations, we can do many things. The priest said, no, if it's not in the written Torah, it does not exist, it's not Jewish. Okay? Huge difference. The other one was more theological and goes back to classes from many, many months ago. The priests, the Sadducees, refused to believe in resurrection, and the Pharisees, the rabbis, believed in resurrection. So the whole concept, we're talking here about more than 100 years, 150 years before Jesus. And it's important because the whole concept of resurrection for the Pharisees was central, not only to their beliefs, but to their identity and what separated them from the priest. That's why the resurrection is so important. So all the Jews who followed the Pharisees, the rabbis, believed in the resurrection. Still today, the main prayer we have, that's 18 benedictions. The second one is about resurrection. Okay? Many Jews don't believe that. It's, oh no, resurrection is a new. No. It was a central core belief of the Pharisees. And as I said, after the destruction of the temple, the Pharisees were in control because there were no Sadducees, there were no priests anymore. So when people were telling stories about resurrection, it was a given. It's no big deal. If 300 years ago somebody would tell you that you went on some machine that would take you from here to New York in 2.5 hours, you would say, no way in the world, right? And today we don't even think about, of course you can have this machine that would take you from here to New York in 2.5 hours. Okay? So during that time, the whole concept of resurrection was taken for granted. Either you were against it or for it, but it was a super important idea. And why is that? Because life was miserable. And when life is so miserable, you want to believe that there is something beyond it. Okay? Either resurrection or life after death or something. But that was the core disagreement between the Pharisees, those who will become the rabbis, and the Sadducees, those who were the priests. The priests said, no way in the world, because it's not mentioned in the Torah. But the Pharisees said, no, we have enough clues in the Bible, and that's the truth. You're talking about 1,000 years difference, more or less, between the Egyptian influence and the time we're talking about now. I don't think so, because we don't have anything in the Torah, as I said, about the whole idea of resurrection does not appear in the Torah. There are two stories about Elijah and Elisha, two of the prophets, who were able to resurrect a dead boy. Okay, probably the same story that just appeared twice under different names. But it's not that it happens on a regular basis, it was a miracle that happened. But what the rabbis, the Pharisees believed is that one day the Messiah will come and everyone will be resurrected. All the dead will come back to life. And it's just a matter of time because things are so bad that the Messiah is just around the corner. Okay? So Jesus said he was the Messiah and was accepted by some. And then, actually it was Paul who said that Jesus was the Messiah. And then when Bar Kokhba just said, I'm the Messiah, it was accepted. And many people said, I'm the Messiah. Okay, it was just part of what's happening. It was a core belief that became stronger and stronger. So, Carol, you started reading and then I gave, but it's important. No, this is one of the most crucial things to know, the difference between the Sadducees, priests, Pharisees, rabbis later on. Okay, please continue. So, John Hyrcanus, he likes the Pharisees. Okay.
Okay, one day he hosted an important banquet. Many Pharisees were there as honored guests. During the meal, Hyrcanus invited them to speak openly. Had he ever done anything wrong in his rule? Most of the Pharisees praised him, but one man, a Pharisee named Eleazar, stood up and said something deeply offensive. He claimed he had heard from elders that Hyrcanus's mother had once been a captive in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. If that rumor were true, he suggested, Hyrcanus should give up the high priesthood because a priest whose mother had been taken captive could be disqualified. The other Pharisees were angry with Eleazar and agreed he should be punished, but they suggested only a mild penalty. Hyrcanus was shocked and hurt. He had expected them to reject the slander completely. Their lukewarm response convinced him that the Pharisees did not truly stand with him. From that time on, Josephus reports, Hyrcanus broke with the Pharisees and turned instead to the Sadducees. He adopted their views and gave them greater influence in his court.
Okay, so John Hyrcanus, was he a priest, high priest, or a king? Both. Okay, he was both, because he was from the dynasty of the Hasmoneans, who assumed both positions. Now, he supported the Pharisees. Most of the priests, high priests, kings did not like the Pharisees, but he did. And then he had this banquet, and he said, if I did something wrong, tell me. It's a good lesson. If a king asks you what he or she did wrong, don't say a word. Don't believe that they really want to hear criticism. Don't do that, okay? Just don't. But this Eliezer had to say, but what did he say? I wanted to look. He said that there is a rumor that Hyrcanus's mother had been a captive in the times of Antiochus, which is during Antiochus was the bad king from the Chanukah story, right? So some 50 years prior, his mother was captive. What does it mean? So first of all, if a king asks you something, what he did wrong, you don't say. But if you must say, don't mention his mother. No, seriously, don't, because there are lines you don't cross. But what is the implication that Hyrcanus's mother was captive? Might not be pure, because maybe his father is not his father. Because you don't just capture women to be nice to them and treat them right. So there is a very good likelihood that his mother was captured, and actually we know that it happened. We don't know, she died, so likely she did not have a child, but if she had a child, it might be from a not priestly blood. Not even a Jewish blood, but certainly not a priest. If she had a child while in captivity, the likelihood is that the father is, in that case, was a Greek person, right? Not an Israelite or a Jew, certainly not a priest, not from a priestly family. Okay? And remember, how does one become a priest? It's hereditary. You must belong to a certain family. You cannot just choose to be a priest. Really not a smart thing to say to a king, even a nice king. You just don't do that. You don't question what happened to his mother, and definitely you don't question his lineage. I think that it would be offensive to each and every one of us, but we don't have the power that he had. Okay, so this is one of the stories that we read about one of the kings, Hyrcanus, John Hyrcanus. I chose different interesting stories. So I didn't just want to give you a whole list of dates and names because it seems too much like a history class in high school. So instead I decided to bring the interesting stories. Most of them comes from Josephus, okay, who wrote during the 1st century. Okay, so he wrote here a little bit after the fact, but he was really close. Any comments, questions, anything? Good story? No, I'd say. Okay, so Hyrcanus used to like the Pharisees, and then he didn't. Okay, let's read about another king. Alexander. Most people, even when you talk about it, use the Hebrew name. It's Yanai, Alexander Yanai. Janneus is in the English pronunciation, but he's known as Yanai or Alexander Yanai. The Talmud writes a lot about him, and he reigned after John Hyrcanus. Who wants to read these texts? You can inherit the mic from Carol. Okay, page 2, text.
Alexander Yanai, the son of John Hyrcanus, ruled as both king and high priest. He openly favored the Sadducees and used their customs in the temple.
Thank you. Just 1 second. So the Sadducees were the priests. Okay, so he did. Please go ahead.
During the festival of Sukkot, the high priest was supposed to pour water on the altar as part of a special libation ceremony. Many people in Jerusalem at that time sympathized with the Pharisees and their traditions. When Alexander Yanai performed the ritual, he deliberately poured the water on his feet instead of on the altar. To many in the crowd, this looked like a direct insult to the Pharisees and to the way they believed the mitzvah should be done. The people were furious, holding their lulavim
that's a plural of a lulav.
And etrogim in their hands. They tore the citrons off and pelted the king with them in the middle of the temple service. They shouted that he was unfit for the high priesthood, calling him son of a captive.
Okay, because he was the son of, yeah.
Reviving the old rumor that a Hasmonean high priest's mother had once been taken captive. Alexander responded brutally. He ordered his soldiers to attack the crowd. Many worshippers were killed. This clash at Sukkot became one of the sparks that helped set off a bloody civil war between Alexander, who was backed by the Sadducees and foreign mercenaries, and his Pharisaic opponents.
Okay, so this is a famous story. It's in Josephus, and also the Talmud refers to it later on. So the new king, now the son of the king we saw before, Alexander Yanai, supported the Sadducees, and people didn't like it. Now, why did the majority of the people like the Pharisees versus the Sadducees? Greek influence. I think most of them were influenced by the Greeks. I think mainly because the Sadducees were a tiny, wealthy, powerful elite. The vast majority of the people were just like the Pharisees, were ordinary people. They didn't come from any special family, no specific lineage, and they were very democratic, the Pharisees, in their philosophy. They said the Torah is open to all of us. The Sadducees says, no, it's only ours. Okay, so the people supported the Pharisees much more than the Sadducees, especially since the Sadducees claimed also the kingship, which was forbidden, and did many other things. And I mentioned it, but I didn't emphasize it enough. Who was the one who collected your taxes? The Sadducees. We never liked the people who want taxes from us. And taxes were different back then. It worked differently. You had people, their role was collecting taxes. They promised the ruler X amount of money. Okay, they didn't have this mechanism, this bureaucracy we have today with the IRS. They know exactly what we make and the whole thing. It's an individual way. No, they would go to Jupiter, and in Jupiter there would be a person who promises the governor, I don't know, from Jupiter, I'm giving you $10 billion. And they didn't care who pays or not, okay? So, but they had to show up with this amount. That was the style more or less everywhere. So it was not an individual thing that people and fair or semi-fair system of paying taxes based on your income. No, I need this amount of money from that town. Okay, and those who were related or did it or were close to it were the Sadducees. Okay, because when you're in the temple, you had to, that's what you did. And most people don't like tax collectors. Just, now, another part of this story is that when we talk about the festival of Sukkot, about the 4 species, right? So we hold the 4 of them, and when we explain why we have 4 different ones, we talk about unity and peace, right? The lulav and the other things, we hold them together, we shake them, we do the whole thing. So during the festival that celebrates unity and peace, so it was just the opposite, right? So they used the lulav and the etrogim not as a peaceful thing, but as a weapon, as they threw it at the king, who didn't find it funny. And we'll see another text. Gee, something happens. The time runs so fast in this class. And he really didn't have any sense of humor, and he would slaughter many of them. He will even, I just don't think we'll get to that document, crucify people. Because that was a nice Roman way, even though they were not under the control of the Romans yet. But why not? It works for the Romans. We want to be like them, and that's what they did. So let's just read the next one, and you'll get a better idea of his cruelty. Anyone who wants to?
After years of fighting between Alexander Yanai and the Pharisees, with foreign armies and Jewish rebels both involved, Alexander finally gained the upper hand. Many of the Pharisee rebels surrendered or were captured. Josephus describes Alexander's revenge in shocking terms. He says that Yanai brought about 800 of his opponents, mostly Pharisees, to Jerusalem. There, in view of the whole city, he had them crucified. As the men hung on the crosses and were still alive, Alexander ordered that the throats of their wives and children be cut in front of them. Josephus adds that the king held a banquet with his concubines while this was happening, watching his enemies die. The message was clear. The Seditian king would crush Pharisaic opposition with maximum terror. According to Josephus, many thousands of the Pharisees fled the country and did not return as long as Alexander lived.
Okay. Now, Josephus probably was exaggerating with numbers, but there is no doubt that Alexander was extremely cruel and had to make a point that he has zero tolerance to the Pharisees and anyone who might try to rebel against him or to express opinions that are in contrast to his. And these are all the Maccabees, by the way. Okay, that's why you have to remember. So we all celebrate Chanukah, and this is few generations later. So what happened to these great people we admire and our little kids? But yeah, power corrupts, right? But that's what happens, splitting of the Jewish people as it happened so often, and it became super brutal. And that's what we call one of the many Judean civil wars of 93 to 87 BCE. Okay, after Yanai died, that's a person I want you to remember, because we have a queen. We have very few female leaders mentioned in Jewish history. So we have Miriam, sort of, but she never gets credit for being a leader. The first one in the Bible is Deborah. Okay, she was a prophetess and a leader. But that was quite unusual, because it was quite unusual in the ancient world. It's quite unusual in the modern world when I think about it too. So yeah, it's not that. How many female presidents we had in our country? It's hard to count. But no, it's so don't be surprised. But in that case, after Yanai died, his wife, Alexandra Salome, became the ruler, the queen. And she will be remembered as the last truly Hasmonean monarch, because after her, the Romans will take over. But let's read this document about her.
When Alexander Yanai was dying, he reportedly gave surprising advice to his wife, Salome Alexandra. He told her that the people hated him, but respected the Pharisees. If she wanted to rule safely after his death, she should make peace with them and give them influence. After Alexander's death, Salome became queen. She made her elder son, Hyrcanus II, high priest, and publicly sided with the Pharisees. She restored their religious practices and traditions that earlier rulers had restricted. Josephus says that she put all things into their power, so that although she had the title of ruler, the Pharisees effectively held much of the authority. They were able to bring back exiles, release prisoners, and shape the law according to their understanding. Later rabbinic tradition remembered her reign as a time of peace and justice, a kind of golden age for the Pharisees. But Josephus hints that the punishment of the Sadducean aristocrats for past actions created deep resentment and helped set the stage for the next civil war between Hyrcanus, I don't know why I can't, the second, backed by the Pharisees, and Aristobulus the second, backed by the Sadducees?
Yeah, Sadducees.
Sadducees, a conflict that eventually drew in Rome.
Okay, so Alexandra Salome, the wife of Alexander Yanai, either because of the advice he gave her or because of she can think for herself, she sided with the Pharisees. Modern scholars try to find evidence that she supported the Pharisees even when Alexander was still alive. Okay? So she just sided with them, if not politically, because he would have killed her, but philosophically, she understood that they were right. She liked their way much better. It is probably not so true, as Josephus writes here, that she gave all the power to the Pharisees. Like, she was nothing, and she couldn't think for herself, she couldn't rule it was not the case. She was a very effective, strong ruler who expanded Judea, the territory of Judea. She accomplished a lot. Okay? Again, the shift from the king who supported Alexander, supported the Sadducees, now we have a queen who supported the Pharisees, and these nice Pharisees who were the victims of the previous king, now when they are close to power, what do? Tortured the Sadducees, because that's what we do. If I have power, I'm going to use it against you, including violence and whatever I can do. Okay? So the Talmud obviously likes the Pharisees better because the Talmud was written by Pharisees. But whoever got the power used and abused it. We are going to jump to page 6. As I always do, I deliberately include more stuff than I even dreamed to have time to cover in the class, but it's good to have it. So we're going to another document here. Now remember, Alexandra Salome had 2 sons, and both of them thought that they should be kings. Okay? So let's read the document. It's a very important one, and it's a very important part of Jewish history.
After Queen Salome, Alexandra died, her 2 sons fought over who would rule Judea. Hyrenius, the older brother, was quiet and cautious. Artobulus, the younger, was energetic and ambitious. Each claimed the throne. Their conflict was not just a family dispute. Judea itself was divided. Many priests and aristocrats supported Aristobulus. Many of the teachers and common people supported Hyrcanus.
Okay, so we have Hyrcanus, who was a Pharisee. That's why he was supported by most of the people and the scholars. And Aristobulus was supported by the priests. Okay? So these 2 sons, one got the priest support, which means political power, money. The other one got the popular vote, the people and the scholars. So that's the situation right now. Who is going to be the king? Please.
Soon words turned into war. Aristobulus seized power in Jerusalem. Hyrcanus fled, advised by Antipater and
Idumean.
Noble. Instead of trying to reconcile, Hyrcanus turned outward. He asked the Nabatean king to attack his own brother. Armies of Judeans and Nabateans now fought other Judeans. News of this chaos reached the Roman general Pompey, who was nearby.
And this is the real Pompey that you know from history. Yeah, this is not like a fake Pompey. This is the time we're talking about. This is the late time of the Roman Empire. Okay, so this is the same. Because when you think about it, Judea, Israel, and Rome are not so far away. You take a boat and it takes a few weeks, but it's not so far away. Okay, please.
Delegations came to him, one from Aristobulus and one from Hyrcanus, and one claiming to speak for the people, begging him to free them from both brothers. Pompey agreed to decide. He marched on Jerusalem, besieged the city, and entered the temple. From then on, Judea was no longer truly independent. Its fate had been delivered into Roman hands in the name of resolving a Jewish civil war.
Okay, this is super important. Super, super important. So after the death of the queen, and the Jews had an autonomy, sovereignty of the land. This is the good times, the rare time when Jews were in control. These 2 sons of the queen couldn't decide. They were fighting. And then they invited the Romans to decide. But if you pay attention, not only these two brothers went to Pompeii, but another group, the people. Okay? Meaning those who supported one of them, and I said, just get rid of these two guys. We don't want any of them. We want somebody else. It doesn't really matter. We're tired of this family. Well, what happened as a result? When you put a shark in a fish tank, he's not going to play nicely with the little fishes, right? It's not a nature of a shark. So Pompey said, okay, I'll decide. And then, well, I like what I see here. It's mine. And that was the end of Jewish sovereignty until 1948. Okay, until 1948. It's, okay, 63 BCE to 1948. So that's why we're talking about 2,000 years of exile. This is the end. Now, things will get even uglier now under the rule of the Romans, because the Jews will continue to fight even more among themselves. Okay, because we remember the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now we're going to have the Zealots, another crazy group. And Sai, you mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls. So let me just say something about it. The Dead Sea Scrolls was a library. That's what it was. So when we're talking about the scrolls, we're talking about several caves in the Judean desert that in the 1940s there were two Bedouin shepherds. One of them threw a stone and heard a sound, went and found some parchments, some documents written on animal skin, and that was the beginning of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I would love one day just to give you a full lecture on that, because I studied a lot about it, probably by the number one expert, Dr. Schiffman from NYU. But in the beginning, people thought that it was all these parchments, all these scrolls belonged to a specific sect. But no, it was a library, just like today. So if you go to my library in my office and say, oh, he's Orthodox, he's Reformed, he's Christian, because I have all the books that, no, seriously. So but in the beginning it was not clear. It took many years. Initially they thought that it was the first Christians. But no, almost all of them came from before Christianity. So that's just something about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what's amazing about it, and that's why they're super important, is that these are the oldest documents we have. Most of them came in tiny fragments. So don't think about the beautiful Torah scroll, like you open the Torah and the Ark. No. Most of them are in a horrible shape, because they were discovered 2,000 years later, and some of them are more. Okay, so this is one dimension of what the Dead Sea Scrolls are. However, in the same place, it's called Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, there was a sect, a Jewish sect. Not necessarily. In most books, you see the Essenes. There was a group by the name of Essenes. There is a debate among scholars if the specific group of Qumran was the Essenes or another group. Let me just say 2 words about it. Who were the Essenes? So we talked about the Sadducees, we talked about the Pharisees. The Essenes said neither of these groups is loyal to real Judaism. Their problem was mainly with the Sadducees, with the priests. So these priests are fake. They don't do what they're supposed to do. They don't practice the way they need to practice. And they said, we're disgusted by that. We cannot live in Jerusalem. We cannot live among these people. We are going away to the Judea desert to create our own community. Okay? Now we know that the Essenes did it. That's why still many people associate the Dead Sea Scrolls with them, but not everyone agrees. But the Essenes just said these Pharisees are fake and we cannot live under them. They were obsessed with purity. They had tons of mikvahs there, even though they were a small community. Scholarship is still flourishing about the kind of community. If there were women there, we know there were some women because we found bones, but are the women were wives or maybe the women were just people who just served the men there? It's not really clear. They had fascinating laws, and so these were the Essenes, okay, another sects, and then we'll have the Zealots. But since, let's say I have 10 more minutes, I want to choose the last document here. Let's go to page 7. Because now the Romans are ruling, and the Romans appointed now the rulers. So it's not that the Jews had to fight among themselves who would rule, but the Romans ruled. The most important ruler or king was King Herod. When you go to Israel, when you go to Caesarea, if you know on the sea, there was a gorgeous, one of the most gorgeous Roman cities was built by Herod. It's still gorgeous. When you go to Jerusalem, to the Western Wall, when you see the beautiful part of it, these tremendously large stones, that was part of Herod's temple. When you see the ugly stones, that was added later on. Okay, he was a master builder, one of the most talented architect builders in the Roman times. The Romans admire what he did. He was not really Jewish. He was Edomian. Because during the ruling, yeah, I know, Edomian. Edom is where Jordan is today. Okay, it's the other side of the Dead Sea, just to put it in there. Okay, during the Hasmonean time, it was the only period in Jewish history when Jews had enough power to force others to convert to Judaism. Okay, today people say, oh, Jews never want people to convert. They never did it because they never had the power. Okay, during that time of the Hasmonean dynasty, they had the power. And even though they were not supposed to do it, they forced some smaller nations to convert to Judaism. And one of them was the Edomites or the Edomians. Okay? Herod was a son of an Edomian. Okay? Which was, and back then, don't think that the religion followed the mother, it followed the father. Yes. I know I'm bursting a lot of bubbles here. And you can obviously look up what I'm saying. But yeah, so it was important who your father was. Now, he was the king of the Jews because the Romans adopted him. And he tried to be nice to them basically by rebuilding the second temple. But it's like you go to some of these fancy, if you drive still in some places here, along the river or something, so there was a nice house that was built 70 years ago, right? And then somebody buys it for $10 million and buys a 20,000 square foot mansion, right? That's our life here in Jupiter, correct? That's more or less what Herod did to the temple. So the temple, the second temple was small. It was, much smaller than our synagogue, probably the whole property here. And he turned it into one of the most magnificent structures of the Roman Empire. Okay, so when we talk about the second temple at the end, it was really the Herodian temple. It's what he did. Okay, and almost nothing was left from it but you can still see the outer wall, which is the western wall, and some of the beautiful stones that he used. He was the most important guy, super cruel, super crazy, and genius. He killed everyone, including his children and his wife, because he married a Hasmonean princess. But he was always afraid that since he was an Edomite, people will rebel against him and will bring back the Hasmoneans as rulers. So it was very effective. Let's kill them all, including wife. Yeah, he was crazy and a genius. Let's just read this last document that we'll see what happened later on. So now we have several Jewish groups, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, okay? And inside of the Zealots, and I don't need to describe the Zealots, just the name Zealots means a lot, they had a super duper Zealots who called the Sikari. Sikari means a dagger. And their style was to go to the people they didn't like in public and stab them. Therefore, they were fondly known as this. The violence there was crazy. And just to remind you, it was violence by Jews against other Jews. So when you think about the Jews versus the Romans, that was the big picture. But when you looked into the detail, that was the frame. Most of the killing was done between different Jewish groups. So let's read this one. Numbers, text in, the text on page 7.
During the Great Revolt against Rome, Jerusalem was not united. A group of revolutionary fighters, often called zealots, controlled the temple. More moderate leaders, including the former high priest named Ananus, son of Ananus, tried to defend the city, while also seeking a realistic way to survive. Ananus was deeply respected. Even Josephus, who criticized many people, praised him as a wise and devoted to welfare of the people. Ananus believed that the zealots were leading Jerusalem to ruin. He gathered men loyal to him and prepared to move against them. The zealots realized that if Ananus remained alive and influential, they would lose control. So they looked for help not from Rome, but from another group, the Idumeans. Under cover of a stormy night, the Idumeans entered the city. Together they broke open the gates and slaughtered Ananus and many of his followers. Josephus writes that Ananus' body and the bodies of the leaders were left unburied, lying in the streets, in direct violation of Jewish law and customs. He comments that the death of Ananus was the true beginning of the destruction of Jerusalem.
Okay, so there was a moderate person who was able to unite, or at least bring some conciliation to the people. The zealots killed him. And Bruce, just do me a favor and read the next one at the bottom of 7 and early 8, because that will give us the full picture.
As the Romans' siege of Jerusalem tightened, the city was divided among several Jewish factions. One major leader, John of Gischala, is that?
Yeah, it's there are many pronunciations of this name. In Hebrew, it's Gush Chalav, but
Gush Chalav held the temple area with his followers. Another, Simon bar Giora, controlled much of the upper city. The third group held other parts of town. Each claimed to fight for the people and for God. None trusted the others. Instead of uniting against the Romans, the factions turned their weapons on one another. They launched attacks, burned houses, and killed opponents inside their own city. In the areas between their strongholds, large amounts of grain and other food had been stored. During the internal battle, one faction set fire to buildings that contained these storehouses. Another faction responded in kind. Soon, most of the food that could have sustained Jerusalem for a long siege had gone up in smoke. Josephus reports that famine descended on the city much sooner because of this deliberate burning. While Roman soldiers waited outside the walls, watching and preparing, Jews inside the city were destroying their own supplies and starving their own people in order to hurt rivals Jewish groups.
Okay, so Jerusalem is under siege. There were people who could fight. They stored food for years, but they had to burn the food to punish the other group, and they killed each other. And the Romans basically just had to wait outside and watch how the brilliant Jews killing each other and did their work. Okay, so we have a history in which we did not remain united for more than about 75 years. And that's something that keeps me up at night, because Israel is almost 80. I'm not saying and when we see how divided modern Israel is, how divided the Jewish community is, I don't know. I'm not saying that tomorrow something will happen, but I don't want any of us to go home and think, okay, Israel existed for almost 80 years, and that's the trajectory forever. Definitely, the last 2 years gave us some reasons to fear that this trajectory might be interrupted or intercepted. And knowing the history of our people is crucial, because we're not good learning from it, but maybe now. So never take Jewish sovereignty of the land for granted. And always remember that those who can really destroy us is us. So on a very positive note. No, but it's important, because if we hide the truth, as we normally do, how many of you knew these stories? Right, that's the thing. We talk about the Maccabees. Yeah, Maccabees have another jelly donut. But this is not important, or at least it's a fraction of what, and then we don't tell the rest of the story. And this is the important thing, the rest of the story, what happened after the Maccabees. How they gave basically Israel, Judea, to the Romans. And when they rebelled against the Romans, the rebellion was not really so much against the Romans as against each other, and they killed each other. So it's a lesson that we keep hiding from ourselves. And I can tell you, this is not the curriculum in religious school either. But that's for a different discussion. So thank you. And happy Thanksgiving, right? Yeah, it's a week from more or less.
See you next week at St. Peter?
Yeah.
At the Interfaith Service?
At 7?
At 7 o'clock at it's St. Peter Church right across the street. The Catholic Church. It's a great interfaith service. And I only speak about it because I've been going for the last 18 years, and other than during COVID, and it's really a feel-good service.
It's great. So if you're in town, Wednesday at 7, 60 minutes or less. No, I'm not speaking there. We rotate the churches and the speakers. So I speak when we do it at Jupiter First. I get. Next year we host, but we'll talk about it after Thanksgiving. I think we have something this Friday. Some dinner or something? I don't know.
I think you have to book that online, though, don't you?
I don't know. These weeks are so busy that I hardly remember what's happening. But see you either Friday or Thanksgiving. If not, happy Thanksgiving. And again, thank you